The moment my supervisor crossed the line, I felt it before I fully understood it. It was subtle, quiet, dressed up as professionalism, the kind of thing that leaves no fingerprints but bruises you on the inside. And if I'm honest, part of me had been waiting for it, not because I wanted it to happen, but because deep down I knew it eventually would. That morning started like any other. The glass building downtown reflected the sunrise, cold and perfect, while I adjusted my blazer in the elevator mirror. I had worked too hard to look anything but composed. Years of long nights, skipped lunches, and proving myself twice as much for half the recognition had trained me to walk into that office with my head high and my emotions neatly folded away. I was leading one of the most profitable projects in our division. The data proved it. The results spoke clearly. Still, there was always that invisible pause when I entered a room, that extra scrutiny in meetings, that polite surprise when my ideas landed with impact. I had learned to live with that pause. What I hadn't learned to accept was disrespect disguised as authority. My supervisor called me into his office late that afternoon. The blinds were half closed, the city behind him blurred and distant. He didn't invite me to sit right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded, studying me like I was a variable he hadn't quite solved. That's when it happened. Not yelling, not insults, just a calculated comment about my tone, my approach, and how some people might find me too confident for my position. He suggested I should be more grateful, more flexible, more aware of my place. The words were smooth, almost rehearsed, but the message was sharp and unmistakable. He was reminding me that everything I had built could be questioned at any moment by him. I nodded. I stayed calm. I thanked him for the feedback. What he didn't see was the shift inside me. As I walked back to my desk, the office noise faded into something distant. Emails popped up, phones rang, keyboards clicked, but my mind was already racing ahead. Not in anger, but in clarity. Because that conversation wasn't just about control, it was a mistake, his mistake. I understood something then that changed everything. I had been playing defense in a game where I was holding all the evidence. Reports saved, messages archived, patterns documented. I had always told myself it was just being prepared. In that moment, I realized it was something else entirely. By the time I shut down my computer that evening, my reflection in the dark screen looked different, calmer, focused, resolved. He thought he had put me back in my place. What he didn't know was that I had just decided to let him believe that right before everything started to unravel. And the next move wouldn't come from him. Silence has a sound when you know how to listen to it. In the days that followed, mine was loud, deliberate, and misunderstood. I became quieter in meetings, more observant, less eager to fill the gaps with brilliance that others were never comfortable acknowledging anyway. To them, it probably looked like I was shrinking. What they didn't realize was that I was consolidating. Every system has patterns. Corporate America thrives on them. Calendar invites tell you who matters. Email chains reveal who controls the narrative. Performance dashboards expose not just productivity, but bias. I had learned this language fluently over the years, even when no one realized I was studying it so closely. My supervisor continued as if nothing had happened. He praised collaboration publicly while quietly redirecting credit. He questioned my decisions in group settings under the banner of alignment. Each move was small enough to be deniable, but together they formed a clear design. And I let him continue, uninterrupted, because I knew something he didn't. That project everyone celebrated? I wasn't just leading it. I had architected the workflow, negotiated vendor terms, and built contingency plans that lived solely in my files. I was the reason deadlines were met and risks never reached leadership. I had emails confirming approvals, revisions requested by him specifically, and timelines he had personally signed off on. Not for protection, I used to tell myself, but for accuracy. Late at night, after the office lights dimmed and the building emptied, I stayed. Not to work harder, but to organize. folder by folder, date by date. I wasn't emotional about it. I was precise, calm, almost detached, because revenge fueled by rage is messy, and I had no intention of being messy. Meanwhile, whispers began to float. My supervisor had started framing me as difficult, not openly, but through carefully planted concerns. Questions about my leadership style, suggestions that maybe I wasn't ready for the next step. I noticed the shift immediately, the way conversations stopped when I walked in, the sudden lack of follow-up after meetings I led flawlessly. And still, I said nothing. What they didn't understand was that silence, when chosen, becomes a strategy. Every overlooked contribution, every subtle exclusion, every decision rerouted around me was another thread added to a much larger picture, a picture I knew exactly how to present when the time was right. Then came the email, a company-wide update announcing a restructuring of leadership on my project. No warning, no conversation, just my supervisor positioning himself front and center, my role reduced to a vague supporting mention buried halfway down the page, my name stripped of context, my work repackaged as a team effort, his team. That was the moment people expected me to react. They waited for disappointment, for resistance, for emotion. Instead, I smiled. Because while he was busy rewriting the story, he forgot something critical. Stories leave trails, and this one had too many witnesses, too much data, and one very inconvenient truth. He had just taken credit for decisions that would soon be questioned at the highest level, and when that happened, he wouldn't be able to explain them without me. As I closed my laptop that evening, my phone buzzed with a meeting request from executive leadership. Subject line, clarification needed. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The silence was about to break, and when it did, it wouldn't be me who spoke first. The meeting was scheduled for 8:30 a.m., but I arrived early, as I always did, not out of obligation, out of intention. The executive floor felt different from the rest of the building, quieter, cleaner, less forgiving. I sat alone at the long table, my notebook closed, my posture relaxed, breathing slow. I didn't need notes. I needed presence. When they walked in, one by one, I watched recognition flicker across their faces. Some knew me only by reputation. Others had heard my name attached to results they never questioned deeply enough. My supervisor arrived last, confident, smiling, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. The meeting began with neutral language, clarifications, alignment, strategic review, the kind of words that pretend nothing is wrong until suddenly everything is. They asked him to walk through recent decisions tied to the project. He spoke smoothly, confidently, owning every outcome with practiced ease. I listened carefully, not to interrupt, but to confirm. Then it was my turn. Not invited formally, not announced, just a simple, polite request from one of the executives for my perspective. That was all it took. The room turned toward me, and in that moment, I understood something powerful. Authority isn't claimed, it's recognized. I spoke calmly, clearly, no accusations, no emotion. I walked them through timelines, dependencies, approvals. I referenced specific checkpoints, deliverables, and risk assessments, each one tied back to documented decisions that hadn't originated where credit was now being placed. I watched my supervisor's posture change, subtle at first, a shift in his seat, a tightened jaw. He attempted to redirect, to summarize, to simplify, but simplicity collapses when faced with precision. An executive asked a follow-up question, then another, each one peeled back another layer. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't defend myself. I simply told the truth, supported by facts that had been quietly waiting their turn. What shocked them wasn't just the information, it was the consistency. Email timestamps aligned, strategy decks matched, vendor communications told the same story. The room grew still, not tense, but alert, attentive in a way that felt rare and final. I could almost hear the recalibration happening in real time. That's when my supervisor tried to speak over me. He framed it as a misunderstanding, a shared effort, a miscommunication, the usual corporate fog designed to blur responsibility. But something had changed. The executives weren't confused anymore. They were curious. And curiosity, in rooms like this, is dangerous for people who rely on control. One of them asked him directly to clarify a decision he had claimed as his own. He hesitated, just long enough. I didn't smile. I didn't look at him. I focused on the table, my hands steady, my pulse calm, because I knew what that pause meant. It meant the story he had been telling no longer matched the evidence sitting right in front of them. The meeting ended without resolution, no conclusions, no statements, just a polite thank you and a promise to continue the conversation. But I felt it. As we stood to leave, one of the executives stopped me quietly, asking if I could stay back for a moment. My supervisor walked out without looking at me, his confidence fractured, his certainty gone. The door closed behind him, and in that silence, I realized this was no longer about credit. It was about accountability, and what they were about to uncover next would make that first meeting feel like a warning shot. They asked me to sit back down. Not urgently, not dramatically, just calmly, as if what was about to happen was inevitable. One of the executives closed the door, not to isolate me, but to protect the integrity of the conversation. That alone told me more than any words could have. They didn't ask how I felt, they didn't apologize. Instead, they asked for clarity, documentation, context. And in that moment, I understood that this was no longer about proving myself. It was about correcting a system that had grown too comfortable overlooking people like me. I opened my laptop for the first time that day. What followed wasn't a data dump, it was a narrative, clean, linear, undeniable. I walked them through months of decision-making, highlighting where direction had shifted, where credit had changed hands, and where accountability had quietly dissolved. Each slide was supported by correspondence. Each timestamp told a story no one could argue with. Their expressions shifted, not to shock, but to recognition. That look people get when something they suspected finally reveals itself clearly. They asked careful questions. I answered without hesitation, not because I had rehearsed, but because I had lived every moment of it. One executive paused longer than the others, staring at the screen. Then she asked something that cut deeper than any accusation: how long this had been happening. I didn't exaggerate, I didn't minimize, I told the truth. Long enough to notice the pattern, long enough to prepare, long enough to understand that speaking too soon would have cost me more than staying quiet ever did. They nodded. That's when they asked for access, full access, files, emails, decision logs, not just from me, but from the entire project chain. The scope had expanded beyond one meeting, one person, one incident. What started as a clarification had become a review, a reckoning. As I packed up, one of them thanked me not for my work, but for my professionalism. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication, because professionalism, in spaces like this, is often demanded more than it is rewarded. When I returned to my desk, the office felt different, quieter, watchful. People avoided eye contact, not out of disrespect, but uncertainty. Rumors travel faster than truth, but truth always arrives with more weight. By the end of the day, my supervisor's calendar was suddenly unavailable. Meetings canceled, doors closed, conversations rerouted. No announcement was made, but everyone felt the shift. Power doesn't disappear loudly, it fades and leaves confusion in its place. That evening, as I gathered my things, an email landed in my inbox. Short, formal, marked high priority. Subject line: immediate role review. I didn't open it right away. I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker on, reflecting off the glass like 1,000 quiet witnesses. Because whatever that email contained, I knew one thing for certain: This wasn't the end. It was the moment the story turned from exposure to consequence. And not everyone involved was ready for what accountability actually looked like. I opened the email slowly, not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I understood what it represented. Words carry different weight when systems start protecting themselves. The message was brief, careful, almost respectful. A request for a role review meeting, executive-led, confidential, scheduled for the following morning. That was when it truly sank in. They weren't deciding if something had gone wrong anymore. They were deciding how far it went. That night, sleep came easily. Not because I was relaxed, but because clarity has a calming effect. I knew my truth. I knew my work. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to be recognized, even if that recognition came wrapped in disruption. The next day, the atmosphere was unmistakable. My supervisor wasn't in the office. His absence was loud. People whispered less and observed more. Leadership assistants moved with urgency. Meetings were shortened. Eyes followed me in a way they never had before. Not curious, not skeptical, but recalibrating. In the review meeting, the tone had shifted completely. They spoke to me as a peer, not explicitly, not ceremonially, but in cadence, in phrasing, in expectation. They asked how I envisioned the project moving forward, what support structures I needed, what obstacles had been limiting progress that leadership should be aware of. No one mentioned my supervisor by name. That omission was intentional. I answered thoughtfully, strategically. I didn't overreach, I didn't demand, I framed solutions, not grievances. Because real influence doesn't announce itself, it becomes necessary. And with every answer, I felt the balance tilt further away from the man who once believed reminding me of my place would keep him safe. Later that afternoon, a company-wide message went out. Not dramatic, not detailed, just a notice about temporary leadership reassignment, pending an internal review. Carefully worded, neutral, but everyone knew exactly who it was about. Desks buzzed, screens refreshed, conversations paused mid-sentence. I stayed focused, because what most people didn't realize was that accountability rarely stops where it starts. Once systems begin pulling threads, they don't stop at the first knot. And I wasn't the only one who had been affected, just the one who had prepared. As the day ended, an executive stopped by my desk. She didn't sit, she didn't smile, she simply told me they would need me to step in more visibly moving forward. Interim, she said. For now. For now. I nodded, thanked her, and watched as she walked away, leaving behind an unspoken truth that echoed louder than any announcement. The power in that room had shifted, and somewhere, behind closed doors, someone was realizing far too late that underestimating me hadn't just been disrespectful. It had been a catastrophic miscalculation, because the final outcome wouldn't just expose what he did, it would redefine who I was in this company, permanently. The announcement came on a Friday afternoon, intentionally timed, carefully framed, and impossible to ignore. By then, the building already felt like it was holding its breath. People sensed an ending approaching, even if they didn't yet know whose story it would be. I was in my new office, temporary, they called it, when the notification appeared. Company-wide. Leadership update. Neutral subject line. But the content carried weight. My supervisor's role had been permanently reassigned, effective immediately. The internal review had concluded with findings inconsistent with company values and leadership standards. No names, no details, just consequences. What followed was the real shock. The same message introduced a structural change to the division, a new leadership approach, a renewed focus on accountability, transparency, and results-driven decision-making. And then, halfway down the page, my name appeared. Not as interim, not as support, as the permanent head of the project. I sat there for a moment, completely still, not because I was surprised, but because I understood the magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't a promotion born from visibility. It was a correction, a recalibration, an acknowledgement that what had been taken from me had finally been returned, with interest. Across the office, reactions unfolded in waves. Some people smiled genuinely. Others avoided my door. A few looked stunned, as if the rules they thought governed this place had suddenly changed overnight. In a way, they had. Later that day, I passed my former supervisor in the hallway. No confrontation, no words. Just a brief moment of eye contact. His expression wasn't angry. It was hollow. A man realizing too late that power borrowed from silence disappears the moment truth speaks. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. Because the real victory wasn't his removal. It was the message sent to everyone watching. That quiet competence leaves records. That grace under pressure becomes undeniable. That underestimating someone who documents everything is a risk no system survives forever. As I closed my office door that evening, the city glowing beneath me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not revenge, resolution. They were shocked because they expected me to break, to react, to burn bridges. Instead, I built one they were forced to cross. And from that side of the table, the view was completely different.